Alright guys, how's it going? I know that you're all patiently waiting on Vega, but there is still a severe lack of reliable information there. One or two 3D Mark leaks and I'm not impressed with any of it, so I'm not doing that Vega video quite yet. So something a little bit different today. I'm quite sure that a lot of you are absolutely baffled by how the stock market works. Like this guy here, who never understood stock pricing and still doesn't. Now the reason for this is, of course, yesterday AMD saw 24% wiped off their share price. Almost a quarter of the value of their shares gone in one day. And if you're not following any of this stuff closely, then you might think, oh dear, they've had an absolute disaster. Or something must have gone badly wrong. This is like AMD's biggest one-day loss in well over a decade. So in this video, I'll take a look at why it happened and whether or not it's justified. I'm no markets genius or anything like that, but I follow it closely enough to understand how the analysts think and have a general grasp of how the whole thing works. And for the money guys amongst you, and I know there are quite a few, then maybe one or two things to help alleviate your nerves a little. So hopefully for you, this will be interesting to see how this is all going to pan out from a technology perspective. So let's set the stage by going back to AMD's previous fourth quarter of 2016 earnings call. Right, so for those of you that know absolutely nothing about any of this, basically speaking, every corporation, every 3 months, has a quarterly earnings call where they basically do two things. They discuss the previous 3 months' business, talking a bit about how many sales they made, how much money they made, and a little bit about how well their products have been received, that kind of thing. Another big part of the call is discussing what they believe will happen in the current 3-month quarter. So for example, back in Q4 2016, this would be discussing the business between October and December of 2016. So they get all the money, they get all the results, that kind of thing, and then talk about what they think's going to happen in the current 3 months. In other words, between January and March. Now, those of you following my channel know that Ryzen has been the big news for months on end in fact. It really did start all the way back last December. So for months now, it's all been about Ryzen, and the reason for that is Ryzen has been a massive launch for the company. AMD always made a huge amount more money on CPUs compared to GPUs, and having a successful Ryzen launch was absolutely critical to the company. But back in this Q4 of last year earnings call, they had a pretty good quarter. Graphics did much better than expected, in fact, which came as a surprise to me. And looking here, we can see that AMD had revenue of $1.11 billion, which is up 15.9% year over year. That's compared to quarter 4 of 2015. And while that looks good, it's coming off the back of a very poor 2015 for the company. But interesting, they beat by $40 million. In other words, they did even better than expected by $40 million, which is actually quite a lot. The next day, AMD's shares had jumped by 12%. And while part of that was having a better than expected quarter, most of the jump was likely down to what they believed would happen in the first quarter of 2017. And that's how the markets generally react. It's less based on what you just had and more based on what you say you're going to have next. So back in Q4 last year, AMD started talking a lot about Ryzen. And looking at their expectations of the first quarter of 2017, we can see that AMD expected revenue to decrease 11% sequentially, that is from the fourth quarter of 2016 to the first quarter of 2017, then that would mean that year over year revenue had actually gone up 18%. Now, for those of you wondering what this 11% sequential decrease is all about, then it's actually quite easy to understand. Obviously, you've got your 4 quarters in a year. January to March is the first quarter, April to June is the second quarter, July to September is the third, and October to December is the fourth. And in the IT world, especially when it comes to the consumer markets, there are far more sales in the second half of the year. For two big reasons. You've got the back to school period where parents buy millions of laptops for their kids going back to school. So that happens in the third quarter of the year. And obviously in the fourth quarter, you've got the holiday period, you've got Black Friday, you've got Christmas. So the third and fourth quarter can easily be way ahead of the first and second quarter in terms of hardware sales. So this 11% sequential drop is due to moving from the fourth quarter holiday season to the first quarter season where people just buy an awful lot less tech. So what AMD is basically saying is, revenue was $1.1 billion, but in the next quarter it's going to drop and it will be less than $1 billion. Right, so roll on to the 1st of May 2017 and the first quarter of 2017 earnings call, where AMD had revenue of $984 million, which is up 18.3% year over year. Now remember, they said it would be 18%, which was a small miss based on the analyst estimates, a very, very small miss. This is basically the same. $400,000 is absolutely nothing. And yet the shares got hammered by almost a quarter. Now you think about that. 3 months ago, AMD said, this is what we're gonna make. And based on that, the shares jumped 12%. And after making almost exactly the amount of money they said they would, the stock price has completely tanked. So for this part of the video, I'm going to take a much closer look at this earnings call transcript. So you've got a bunch of high-ups at AMD, including of course their CEO, Lisa Su, and their Chief Financial Officer, Devinder Kumar. Now Lisa started by saying that she was pleased with the first quarter product execution and improved year-over-year financial results. So looking at computer and graphics segment, that's all their CPUs and all their graphics, including the professional graphics segment. Fourth straight quarter of double-digit percentage year-on-year revenue growth. In other words, continuing to sell much better than during the previous year, which as I said was not a very good year. And here we can see that strong demand for Ryzen CPUs and improved GPU sales resulted in a computing and graphics segment revenue increase of 29% from a year ago. Now, computing and graphics revenue declined only 1% sequentially. Now remember, the first quarter of a year should be much worse than the previous fourth quarter because you've gone from the Christmas period onto the period where nobody buys really much. So the revenue only went down 1%, and this was down to significant growth in the desktop processor sales, driven of course by 1 month of Ryzen CPU sales, largely offset of course by the seasonal declines in GPU and notebook APU sales. So everything else goes down, yet overall the revenue only went down 1% because of Ryzen and only 1 month of Ryzen sales. And solid demand has driven their highest desktop processor revenue in more than 2 years. And the Ryzen CPUs have been consistently ranked among the top selling processors at global e-tailers and retailers. And a cursory check of this shows it to be true. I've seen links in Germany, South Africa, and from other e-tailers, Ryzen CPU sales have been pretty much tying with Intel sales. Now this is pretty important because this is very much being sold to the DIY crowd, the enthusiasts, and the boutique PC guys. So none of your big guys like HP or Lenovo or Dell, none of them have sold any Ryzen systems, and yet Ryzen is doing very, very well. But only last week, the first Ryzen-based OEM gaming laptops were announced, and additional launches are planned for major OEMs later this quarter. Now, we've already seen, I think it was the Acer Aspire, which I believe was the first OEM gaming desktop. Looking at the graphics, Polaris-based notebook design wins drove increased mobile GPU sales, and once again, higher professional graphics revenue from a year ago. So that's one of AMD's 2 segments. You've got CPU and graphics, obviously doing pretty well. And looking at the second segment, which is the enterprise, embedded and semi-custom segment, of which the vast majority of business is the game consoles, we can see that revenue is once again up by 5% on a year ago. So literally everything has gone up, with the money coming in, everything they said it would be. Now, before I move on to the reasons for why the stock tanked, I'll talk a little bit about gross margins. Now, Devinder Kumar is talking, and he said that gross margin was up 2 percentage points, up to 34%, which is pretty low. In fact, it's very low for a tech company, but it's up 2 percentage points year over year. The reason for which was higher revenue from computing and graphics segment, again due to Ryzen desktop processor sales. Now AMD is in a bit of a different position to the rest of the tech stocks, for example, like Intel and Nvidia, who have much higher margins. And one of the biggest reasons for this is what we just talked about. We know that AMD has computer and graphics segment, and they also have their embedded semi-custom or their console segment. The console segment is very, very low margin. It's high volume. I believe they're still selling well over 20 million console chips every year, but they are not getting paid an awful lot for each one. So this drives gross margin down, and it's simply based on high volume, low margin chip sales. And we are talking a few million chips. So even with that, what I would guess to be maybe 500,000 Ryzen CPUs has driven gross margins up 2 percentage points. Now obviously the Ryzen CPUs are selling for much, much more. We know that the 1800X is $500, the 1700X is $400, and in silicon terms, that's pretty highly priced, especially for recent AMD silicon. The consoles, on the other hand, AMD's going to be lucky if they're getting $100 for each of those console APUs. So low gross margins, mostly down to high volume, low profit sales basically, to Microsoft and Sony. And now moving on to one of the main reasons why the stock dropped 25%. Analysts at these events are looking for gross margins more than anything else, but Devinder continued with his outlook for the second quarter of 2017. So this is the quarter we are in now, from April to June. So AMD expects revenue to increase 17% sequentially, but gross margin to only be approximately 33%, which is down on the current 34%. Now this is part of what has really spooked the analysts, because they would expect margins to go up based on higher volume Ryzen sales. So after that, you come to the question and answer session. And this is when all the financial guys, all the analysts, ask questions of Lisa and Devinder, basically just looking for clarification on all of these matters. So some questions are like, what might have limited sales of Ryzen in the quarter? And basically how Lisa would characterise how Ryzen has gone so far. And Lisa says Ryzen has performed as we expected, which should be obvious because they've made almost exactly the same amount of money as they said they would 3 months previously. They did say that there was a little bit of shortage in terms of motherboards, which obviously we did see, but that only lasted a couple of weeks. But the analysts continued to ask about gross margins, and analysts really like to talk about gross margins. Gross margins are, of course, a very, very important yardstick of a company's performance. It shows how much profit they are making on each sale, but it's not everything. And like I said, AMD are in a different position to the rest because of the game consoles. But it's safe to say that with a full quarter of Ryzen, this quarter we are in now, the second quarter, will see 3 full months of Ryzen sales, yet they're guiding gross margin down slightly sequentially, down from the current 34% to 33%. But this guy at least knows that the new gaming console business starts to ramp up for the upcoming season in that quarter as well. In other words, even though Ryzen will be selling more CPUs, the game consoles will be selling even more. But he says, even based on that, the sequential down gross margin surprised a couple of folks. It does make sense because you would expect Ryzen sales at much higher profit for AMD would have raised the margins upwards rather than down 1 point. But Lisa goes on to explain that game consoles are at their lowest point in the first quarter. They've just sold a bunch of game consoles for the Christmas period, so Sony and Microsoft are buying an awful lot less in the first quarter. But Lisa says if you compare to last year's second quarter, the margins have gone up, but it still doesn't look great. But the main reason for this is how Ryzen is ramping. When you've got a new product launching like Ryzen, obviously there will be very strong initial demand, so you want to have enough CPUs ready to meet that initial demand. And I just said something like 500,000. It could be as much as 1 million there. I'm not entirely sure. But AMD would have been stockpiling their most expensive R7 CPUs for this initial launch. But in the second quarter, we of course now also have Ryzen 5 in addition to Ryzen 7. And we know that the Ryzen 5s are cheaper, but they're based on the same Ryzen 7 CPU. So every sale of Ryzen 5 will lower gross margin compared to a sale of Ryzen 7. And because Ryzen 5s are cheaper, they will sell more CPUs than Ryzen 7s. And on top of that, Microsoft and Sony now start rebuying a lot more game console chips in preparation for the third and fourth quarters. So you've got all of this mixing together, and AMD reckons it's going to cost them 1 point of gross margin, from 34 down to 33%. They will be selling more chips because revenue is going up 17%. They're making more sales. It's just that they're not likely to see the initial Ryzen 7 sales, which are of course partly down to pent-up demand. Enthusiasts like us are buying these CPUs because we've been looking forward to them for a very long time. But with that pent-up demand gone, we're really looking at more Ryzen 5s being sold and less money per CPU. But overall, we should expect many, many more CPUs to be sold. Another interesting factor working against the margins is that over time, the console margins actually drop. The average selling price of each game console APU comes down over time. Every quarter, Sony and Microsoft pay less for the same console chip. But on the Ryzen ramp, if you think about AMD's last successful CPU, most of you probably look way back and say, well, it must have been an Athlon back in the early 2000s. But in actual fact, AMD's last successful CPU was their Brazos, their AMD E-series CPUs. These were tiny APUs, CPU and graphics, something like 75 square millimeters. Launched back in 2011, and the market was pretty much flooded by these. They wiped out Intel's Atom line, and the Bobcat core became the Jaguar core that you now see in today's game consoles. It's been a very, very successful architecture, And in 2011, after launching at the end of January, AMD went on to sell just under 30 million of these in 1 year. 30 million CPUs. Now, even back then, that must have been around about 1/8 of the market. You think about that, AMD supplying 1/8 of the market with one CPU architecture. Everybody remembers how bad Bulldozer is, but hardly anybody remembers just how well Brazos sold for AMD. But the thing about this was, let's say they sold 27 million of these in 1 year. That isn't split evenly over the year, of course, because we've already talked about how this works. The first 6 months are much worse than the last 6 months of the year. But more than that, it just takes time for the ramp. In other words, for the CPUs to be created and shipped out the door and into the hands of the sellers. In the first month of 2011, AMD shifted about 1.5 million of these. And in the first quarter of 2011, they sold around 3 million of these at the start of the Brazos ramp. What was interesting though was, in the second quarter, AMD had shifted 6 million. So 3 million in the first quarter, 6 million in the second quarter, and I don't have the full numbers for the third and fourth quarters, but I believe them to be around 8 million in the third quarter and 9 million in the fourth quarter 2011. One of AMD's most successful CPU architectures ever, but the important thing here is how it ramps. 3 million sales in the first quarter. By the end of the year, 27 million sales. Now Ryzen is a bigger CPU. It's 213 square millimeters. And because of AMD's pricing, there is no way that it's going to sell 26 million CPUs. Not these Ryzen 7s and Ryzen 5s. The price of these CPUs puts a top limit on how many can realistically be sold. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the numbers are for the high end and the high mid range of the market. But if we assume we've seen 500,000 sold already, in this first month, maybe only expect another 1 to 1.5 million sold in the second quarter, which again is a slow quarter for CPU sales. But in the third and fourth quarters, we should reasonably expect to see these numbers jump to 3, 4, maybe even 5 or more million units in each of the third and fourth quarters. And to more and more questions about margins, Lisa continued to emphasise this. I think you should expect that we will expand margins as we go through the year. And once again, with another analyst asking about margins, Lisa says, look, we're not anticipating that we gain significant amount of share over our historical numbers. In other words, around 25% of the market. Where Lisa says she reckons, margins are going to be 36 to 40% and it's basically going to be based around PCs. And Lisa also says that going into 2018, you'll see a larger percentage of that be in servers. So there's another thing. AMD is of course launching Naples as well, which is their server version of Ryzen. And AMD basically has zero server market. They've been wiped out because Bulldozer was just crap. Absolutely useless CPU. And they really don't have anywhere to go except for up. But there's even more than that because of course Ryzen 3 will be launching as well, and also Ryzen laptops. So Ryzen 7 was at the very high end, Ryzen 5 has started, although they've got no money from this so far, remember. Ryzen 3 is coming next, that's your entry level quad cores, and then you have the entire mobile portfolio as well. Half of this has started now, with the other half coming. Now, I haven't even spoken about Vega. Vega will just be another benefit to AMD. Whether or not they can beat Nvidia, I don't know. I don't even think it matters any longer. Looking at this at a high level makes everything very, very clear. You just need to look at what AMD had before, compared to what they have just launched and what they have coming. Ryzen is so much better than Bulldozer that it simply cannot fail in any market segment, and it won't fail. Vega is just gonna help. Polaris was solid but unspectacular. Vega is just gonna help. Very importantly, of course, is Naples in server. There is a lot of money in servers. Although AMD is probably not gonna see an awful lot of it this year, that's more of a 2018 thing. So yeah, I've rambled on again. What is all this about really? Why did a quarter get knocked off this stock? Well, a bunch of stuff created the perfect storm. According to Robinhood, which is an app that lets you buy and sell shares, AMD seems to have a lot of millennial shareholders. In all honesty, most people don't really fully understand how this works. In fact, absolutely nobody fully understands how the stock market works. But a lot of people would have panic sold here. With hindsight, it was completely obvious that AMD's share price was going to drop after this quarterly conference. But I don't think anybody expected it to drop this far. You got a bunch of people cashing out. People who bought AMD stock at $2. They've decided to cash out now. You've got all the short sellers who were just waiting on the first bit of bad news, which isn't really bad news. The gross margin stuff, it's not really bad news. It should have been expected, but there's so many people manipulating stocks now as well. So you've got an initial drop in the stock, and then a bunch of millennials start panicking, and the share price simply tanks during the day. What it comes down to though is AMD's fundamentals are very, very sound because they finally have a good product lineup everywhere. This 24% wipeout is a nonsense, and I expect to see a recovery during this second quarter, but with 2017 and in any other year, it's really all about the second half, the third quarter and the fourth quarter. If you wanted to make a massive amount of money on AMD, then last year was the year to do it, when they jumped from something like $1.80 to, $12. The most successful stock in 2016. AMD were the highest growth stock in 2016. Out of anyone, that was the high growth phase of making the money. Now I believe that they are much more attractive in investment terms. But if you're going to invest in AMD, you're going to go through these days where the stock tanks, because there is a lot of manipulation there and there's a lack of understanding. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people saw this first quarter results and thought to themselves, I thought Ryzen was going to be the saviour of AMD, completely oblivious to the fact that it's only really been on sale for 1 month, and you're talking a small fraction of the total CPUs that AMD will shift in the entire year. AMD could probably shift around 20 million Ryzen CPUs, depending on how well the ramp goes, on the desktop, in mobile, in servers. Could be talking about 20 million. I'm not entirely sure, but right now I'll be surprised if they've even shifted 1 million of that. So don't worry about the margins. When you understand how it works, then it all makes perfect sense, right? But if I were looking for an investment opportunity based on the fundamentals of a company's products and looking at the tech, then I cannot see a better company than AMD right now. It's not about what they've got, it's about what they've now got compared to what they had. And if AMD is worth $10 based on what they've got right now, then they surely must be worth $20 by the end of the year based on what they should have at that time. Just be aware that, yes, of course, that is AMD we're talking about. And if anything can go wrong, this is the company it's going to go wrong with. So I hope this cleared up a few things. It's a difficult topic and it's probably bored the hell out of some of you. But the way I treat these videos is if you learn one thing or anything whatsoever, then at least you know more than you did before you started watching this. I'll catch you later, guys.